To carry on a little about the Cornish language, I should talk a little bit about Dolly Penton. She was born in the 1690s and died 1 year after America's independence. Her entire life was spent in the small, remote village of Mousehole. Although others could continue to speak Cornish, and actually did continue to speak using some slang and numbers up until the present day, she was the last one who grew up with Cornish as her first native tongue. Her reputation is a little bit mixed. Most see her as something of a folk hero, but some argue that she may have even been a witch. She cursed at people in Cornish, calling them ugly black toads, and there was a lot of folklore surrounding her, and when she grew older, people saw her as this ancient hag who could speak and communicate less and less with the people around her. She had some success with telling folk tales in her old age, but either way her death is seen as the death of a culture and an ancient language, an entire branch of Celtic culture, and a remnant of King Arthur and Donier died in 1777, and at 102 years old she passed away and was buried by 8 fishermen in a rain. No tablet was erected to her memory until a good time later. Prince Louis Lucien Bonaparte, a relative to Napoleon, set up this stone decades later in 1860. As a wealthy man and a global traveler, Louis had a fondness for the mysteries of the world. He visited this village years prior, searching for the last remnants of the Cornish culture, probably expecting to find some food or folklore, but he actually was able to find that there were still folks speaking a few words of Cornish here and there. They set out to memorialize their last true monoglot, hoping to revive an interest in the Cornish language. I noticed that a lot of the graves here echo different graves in other coastal towns. It was very, very important to the British Royal Navy. So you see many people who disappeared at sea, many master mariners. You even see a master mariner who has the last name Pentrith, who may have even been a descendant. And this town also has some other interesting history. It was involved in the 1595 raid on Mount Bay, where the Spanish Armada destroyed the entire town. The only building was called Cuguin Arms, a local pub, and it was also apparently a very, very important town. More important even at the time than Penzance, if you judge by the taxes that were collected from it. So this town went from being a very important town for fishing and commerce to more or less a small local community where the Cornish language basically fizzled out.
Buried nearby this spot in the graveyard in Donier is a man named John Davey, and he was one of the last people to possess any real knowledge of the Cornish language. I've already filmed a little bit and said a little bit about the history of Dolly Penton a little bit further west of here, but this was the last man that had any secondhand knowledge. So Penton, her whole thing was she knew the knowledge from birth and spoke no English, but in 1890, this was the man that had the last of any original knowledge from his family and his father, and he was able to bring to modern antiquarians songs in Cornish that nobody else had known existed. And this is a little bit, if you want to zoom in a bit on this, of the history of the Cornish language, because people call Cornish and Welsh separate languages, but in reality, these languages were the languages spoken on all of the British Isles. So here in Wales, you had a man named Vortigern, and he was the king of the Britons. And the Romans had left. Around the year 400, the Romans leave, and they promise they'll come back, but they never do. And you have in the 450, around that era, you have the moans of the Britons. They write begging for help. And the help from the Romans doesn't arrive. Well, the Anglo-Saxons are trying to set up settlements along the coasts down here. And Vortigern says to the Anglo-Saxons, he goes to 2 mercenaries named Hengist and Horsa, and he says, if you help me take the kingdom of Kent right here, I will give you money because you're mercenaries. And he sent down his daughter as a goodwill gesture. And well, they won the battles for him, and they established a kingdom there for him, and he didn't pay them. And he said, my daughter should be enough, surely. And they took his daughter, and they killed his son, a man named Cadogan. And the Anglo-Saxons expanded, and they kept pushing out, spreading their Germanic language all throughout the English and all throughout what used to be Britain. And the original language would spread over here. And for a period of time, Wales and Cornwall were connected. But the Anglo-Saxons eventually established a kingdom called Wiki right here, cutting them off at the pass, and it was later incorporated to a kingdom called Mercia. which cut them off entirely. And this section here became known as Dumnoia, and the language of Cornish became distinct over the next several centuries from Welsh. And you have now the Welsh language survives because they've done a good job at preserving it, but Dumnoia actually was pushed farther and farther back. So Cornwall is just a very little tip right here. And the fact that this language was able to survive until 1891 at all is, I think, almost a miracle.
This ancient hill fort, Kelly Rounds, is loaded with Arthurian history. Sadly, half of it is now an industrial park, and the other half is overgrown and not signposted. However, this makes it even more interesting, leaving it mostly untouched by tourists. To start with, it's got an important and strategic position. From the fort, you'd be able to see ships approaching the nearby harbor, and it seems to have been some ancient pilgrimage site if we can judge by the famous three-holed cross only a few hundred yards away. These used to act as waypoints for pilgrims, but what exactly it marked is now lost to history. Carbon dating places occupation of the site from 400 to 100 BC, but there's evidence dating all the way back to 1250 BC. Its other name, Castle Killiberry, has led to it being considered the lead candidate for Kellywig, or King Arthur's home fort. Kellywig translates to forest grove, as many of these ancient Roman forts, which were later reoccupied by Britons, and early Christian sites, were built in circular shape on top of old Celtic sacred groves. The ancient Welsh Triads discusses the three tribal kingdoms of Britain and lists, quote, Arthur as chief prince of Kellywig in Kierno, or Cornwall, before listing bishops and elders of the area. Other sources from the Middle Ages say that Mordred punched Arthur's wife here, which may have led to the Battle of Camlan, or the death of King Arthur. This was amid Mordred's exposure of the affair that Lancelot was having with his Guinevere. Whatever the case, Kelly Rounds is a very interesting hill fort that you would never otherwise see. It's not signposted from the road, it's not National Heritage lists it on an index of at-risk sites, and it is mostly now pretty much forgotten, but it's a must-see for any fan of King Arthur, I think. This is Rosemary Pool, an isolated lake out on Bodmin Moor. King Arthur fans will recognize it as the home of the Lady of the Lake, who in different stories bestows Arthur with the sword of Excalibur, raises Lancelot after the death of his father, casts away the wizard Merlin, and brings Arthur's body to the legendary island of Avalon. According to medieval legend, one of Arthur's most loyal knights, Bedivere, brought his sword to the lake after Arthur's fatal wounding by the evil King Mordred at the 6th century Battle of Camlan. He held it up and hesitated, hiding the sword and telling Arthur he'd thrown it in. When Arthur asked him what happened, he knew Bedivere was lying because he saw no lady in white. He kindly requested the grieving Bedivere to return, and he did. This time, the Lady of the Lake reached out of the water to grab the sword before it broke the surface. She gently lowered it, and it said that she will reward it to the next king of the Britons whenever one should arise. After this, she brought the body to Avalon and left without the knight. The legend concerning the Lady of the Lake who takes King Arthur's body off to the Isle of Avalon sometimes has this island in the center of the lake surrounded by mist or fog, which only pops up at certain points in history. This is surprisingly common in Celtic folklore. For example, the island of Lyonesse was said to lie directly off the cliffs of Plymouth, and this island was said to have a number of British kings all their own. There was also a large ancient land that was said to be off the coasts where the Isles of Scilly are now, a land that was also vanished to time. And in Ireland, you have the island of High Brazil, which is only visible one day every 12 years through the fog, an island that can never be approached, and one fisherman who was able to approach it said that the entire place was inhabited by giant rabbits guarded over by a single wizard. Another legend concerning the pool is of a local anti-hero, Jan Tregeagle. He made a Faustian deal with the devil in his life, so when he died, he was cast to the lake, challenged to empty it with a leaking limpet shell. His ghost can still be heard howling across the moors. These stones in a remote field called Boscawen Un play an important role in British Celtic culture. The English Christians came along with their own stories, often claiming they were pagans or witches turned to stone for dancing on the Sabbath. In truth, Boscawen Un was probably one of three Gorsets. When the English had pushed their original inhabitants of the islands to the westernmost part of their homeland, the Britons had a small cultural revival. The Gorseds were repurposed ancient stone circles and Druid sacred groves, now used for long festivals of acting and poetry. After a cultural revival not long ago which began in modern Wales, Cornwall followed. The yearly Gorsedd in southwest Britain is held by the Old Cornwall Society, and it changes location every year, but it's been held here several times. The Welsh Triads of Arthurian legend talk about Boscawen of Donier, which could only be referring to this. I find it interesting that the central stone is larger than the rest, and archaeologists say it was actually erected to lean, not that it began leaning over the centuries. I'll go back to an older explanation I gave in Jersey for my beliefs on their original purpose. I believe that the pagans thousands of years ago who originally built these did so for a type of ancestor worship. Large stones would form a burial wall for a mound of dirt shaped like a womb, and a tunnel would be made to the central cave. Sometimes a phallus would be here in the center. This represents a blending of masculine and feminine, and explains why there's often nearby springs, all associated with a welling up of the earth, a feminine energy compared to the more masculine sun. The warriors, the druids, the pagan priests would all be buried or cremated and buried in urns in the center of this. When the sun would rise on important days of the year, it would immediately cast a bright light into their burial chamber. This acted as a sort of solar calendar and served to imbue the ancients with a sort of ritualistic light that came about once or twice a year. What could be more close to the earth, or close to worshipping the earth gods, if you buried somebody in a giant womb? A womb that was filled with both feminine and masculine symbols that were illuminated by the sun on days of the year that were associated with feminine energy, the bringing of life, the harvest. To expound on this a little more, the entrance would be reserved for initiates and could only be accessed by climbing over a stone. This sort of makes you leave the realm of the earth and enter the realm of the mysterious, the realm of the ancestors. And this is why almost all of these mounds, almost all of these circles, have a large toppled monolith on the outer ring. The standing stone just survived the erosion that carried the rest of the dirt away, and now it seems like it's a big circle of stones, when in reality, this was more of a retaining wall for a large mound of earth that looked like a womb. The original cultures died off, and newer ones gave them their own legends. In Kent, the Saxons buried their warriors and royalty in them. In Cornwall and Wales, as the English came in, it was said that they were revelers breaking the Sabbath, or witches that were punished by God. Modern folklore also says that they're a place where fairy folk live, just on the edge of modern society, often making their homes inside of the ferns and the streams that run through them. I passed this stone not too far away from Boscawen Un, just on the edge of the A30. It stands 10 feet tall, and you can actually see it if you're looking from over the hedges that border along the highway to Land's End. And the story, which I mentioned earlier, matches perfectly with the sort of English legends that kind of explain away the existence of Boscawen Un. The blind fiddler is just a man who played the fiddle on the Sabbath and angered God, who turned him into a stone. And these legends are common for a lot of these standing stones all throughout the country, but it's a beautiful and interesting place, and in the 19th century it's said that a great burial was discovered there. Unfortunately, like a lot of sites that are associated with Victorian archaeology, not much of a record was kept of this, so we don't really know what was the significance of it. The town of Totnes is a normal-looking small city in Cornwall, but hiding along the main street is a small stone that the early English believed was the first place the island was discovered. According to a 9th century legend, Brutus was the son of Ascanius, who founded Alba Longa in Italy, a city which would go on to form the Roman Empire. When his father went to a magician to ask the future of his child, the wizard said he would be the bravest man on earth. Ascanius, taking this as a challenge or an insult, killed the magician, causing his wife to die in childbirth, and so Brutus was born. As he grew, Brutus found himself banished from Italy as he accidentally shot his father with an arrow. He wandered around on a series of adventures, founding the city of Tours, and finally setting foot on this stone in Totnes. He named the island after himself, and defeated a race of giants that lived here by throwing their king off a nearby cliff. A version of Historia Brittonum, famous for its legends of King Arthur, says that Brutus is actually Ascanius' grandson, and that his father is Silvius. This would mean that he was a direct descendant of Noah, because Silvius believed his family was tied to that of Ham, one of Noah's sons. The early stories of his life are also synchronized with the rule of Eli and Israel and the taking of the Ark of the Covenant by the Philistines. Of course, this history is more pseudo-history and folklore, but it does form, alongside the legends of King Arthur, as a pseudo-history that is so old that it can be taken as fascinating history in itself. These people truly did believe that they were descendants of these fascinating ancient cultures that predated Rome and that they grew up alongside the formation of the holy state in Israel. One of the biggest mistakes you can make as a traveler is only seeing the main attraction and ignoring the other sites around it. The huge majority of Americans who visit Stonehenge usually never realize they're on a massive sacred site with dozens, if not hundreds, of burial chambers all around them. The same is true for smaller sites like the Hurlers, which are fascinating on their own, but when looked at closer, are clearly a part of a huge ancient ceremonial complex on a plot of land that must have had some sort of sacred meaning to these ancient people. In 1605, Richard Carew wrote down local legends in his Survey of Cornwall and left an inflection that makes me feel like he almost believed them. He says, "And a strange observation takes place here, as at Stonehenge, to which a redoubled numbering never numbers the first. But far stranger is the country people's report that once they were men, and for their hurling upon the Sabbath, so metamorphosized." After his observations, he touches on a story he heard of a traveler from Germany who actually witnessed rebellious locals being turned to stone for the same reason. Hurling is a very famous local sport in Cornwall, and the fact that hurling games took place here is again an important modern part of Cornish culture, in the same way that poetry and gorseds took place at Boscawen and Oon. The goalposts in a game of hurling are about a mile apart, and the hurling ball is an orange-sized piece of wood coated in silver. It's now mostly played only in St. Ives and St. Column, and is a very localized, almost performed only for tourism sport. Another legend says that the locals had worn themselves down playing this ancient game, and a local saint, a man named St. Clear, for whom the parish is named, asked them to follow him into church. When they were too tired to go, he was the one who turned them into stone in order to make an example of them. But stepping back, you can see that there are actually 3 stone circles, along with the pipers, 2 pillars a good distance to their side. Not far away, down the road about a mile, is an ancient cross called Long Tom. It's one of the best preserved examples of a Cornish wayside cross, and it lines up with the 3 stone circles across Bodmin Moor, as well as a large burial site a short distance to the opposite side. This led some antiquarians to think it may be a recarved pagan shrine. Another 2 minutes down the road is the beautiful Donier Stone. It shows the close ties the Britons had with the Irish. When the Irish monks would win in battle against the pagans, they would set up wooden crosses. Once they actually secured the territory, then they'd erect large stone monuments such as this one. Beneath this stone is said to be a large ancient oratory. The cross has a memorial for this ancient king of the Britons in Cornwall, the last recorded king of the region who had any power worth acknowledging. It says, "Donier has asked for this stone for his soul's sake." Welsh chronicles mention a king by a similar name, saying he drowned in the river in 875. He was probably buried here because it represented a victory of the Britons with an alliance of the Irish against the pagans. The Irish, however, recorded Donier's death pretty differently, claiming that he was actually executed for collaborating with the Vikings in their plans to attack the West Saxons. They were defeated by King Alfred the Great, but for a while managed to push their borders all the way back to Exeter. This is probably the last gasp of the traditional Brittonic culture, a last gasp of King Arthur, who died several hundred years before this. This is truly one of the last times that the original sort of druidic Celtic Britons were making one final push against the Anglo-Saxons. This is the home of James Painter, leader of the Jacobite rising in Cornwall. I came to St. Columb Major to tell the story of the last uprising here in Cornwall, which happened at his hand in 1715. King George I was declared a monarch, but had a distant relationship to King James II, who himself was ousted by King William in the Civil War and exiled. However, James Stuart, a Catholic and actual son of the pretender, was still alive. Most Catholics in the country were supportive of James Stuart and called themselves Jacobites. Major riots broke out on the coronation of King George. It reached the level of open warfare in Scotland and Ireland, but Cornwall had an abortive go at it too. Here in the West Country, they hoped to take Bristol, Exeter, and Plymouth, and that they hoped that smaller towns would follow suit, but they were arrested when they found out that one of the members of their group was a spy. The ringleaders were released from jail because of a packed Jacobite jury, and they were paraded all the way to Land's End by Jacobists with bonfires and white feathers in their hats. Accompanying them was James Painter, who was given peerage by the Jacobite family. His family was so supportive of James that there were rumors that the young pretender, Charles Stuart, was hiding in their home. In October 1716, James III was declared king in the town square of St. Columb by a number of townspeople, including the town barber, pewter worker, and tailor. In Cornwall, the movement stayed less violent because it was supported by wealthy intellectuals, but in Ireland and Scotland, it was supported by revolutionary laypeople and Catholics. Also interesting about St. Columb are its Arthurian sites, including St. Column's Cross in the churchyard. Columba of Cornwall was the daughter of the Queen of Orkney and King Lot, both pagans and characters in Arthurian legends, both from Scotland. Although she received visions from God promising her love and purity, her father arranged a marriage with another pagan. She stole a boat sailing to Cornwall, but was pursued by the mad prince who beheaded her. From her body flowed a spring in this town, which is said to drain to the ocean. This ancient cross marks the spot of her execution.
Around me are the offerings that are left at St. Madron's Well. And what interests me about Cornish history and Welsh history and the saints here is the link to the Celtic past. We don't know much about who St. Madron was, but local lore says that he was a male saint that performed a number of miracles, and a lot of these miracles came after his death, particularly around this well and baptistry that we'll see a little bit further up the road. But what other commentators have said is that he's a retelling of the Celtic female saint Madron, who was the daughter of Vortimer. Vortimer himself was a king of Gwent, and he opposed his father Vortigern and his policies of appeasement to the Anglo-Saxons and using the Anglo-Saxons to help force other Celtic tribes out of Kent and try to establish a greater territory there. There's also said that this could be the complete retelling of the Celtic god of the earth, or goddess of the earth, Madron. And the using of the Clutie well and the offerings that are left are sort of remnants of an older ritual. And let me see if I can't find the ritual goes. You take a piece of colored fabric, you dip it in the natural waters that are springing up from the ground, you get it completely wet, and you tie it. It's a little cold right now, but you tie it around your arm, you say a little prayer, and then you tie it to any suitable tree branch, really. I'll just tie it right here. And the myth is, or the folklore is, once the fabric rots off, your prayer, your wish, it'll come true. Good. Well, my friend actually hasn't seen this yet, so I'm planning on showing you as we walk. The stream from the well comes down right over through here, and this is an ancient church that would be used as a baptistry. And it's more of just a spot to perform baptisms and at later points be used in kind of folklore ceremonies. But this is an ancient church, and you can see it still has an interesting old altar inside of it, right up here. And the modern sort of pagan movement or spiritual movement, a lot of times they like to leave their little offerings of shells. I'll just put this one back up here. But I always put these back, but I'm curious what it is. Jewelry wrapped around leaves. I'll make sure that doesn't blow away. And flowers, little shells. Cool.
Until recently, this small town was the last place to celebrate Picrus Day. While most of Cornwall celebrates St. Piran as the man to discover tin, the miners of this area tell stories of a man named Picrus. Antiquarian Robert Hunt said that St. Piran was almost unknown in this part of Cornwall, Blackmore, and that the legend of Picrus may in fact be true. He believes that it may be possible that Picrus did discover the process, which was later attributed to St. Piran. This celebration was especially popular in Luxulyan, where it was held at the Rising Sun Inn. The owners of the tin mines would give their workers 1 shilling each to celebrate, and the festival was always held on the second Thursday before Christmas. Another interesting note about this town is the sovereignty of the Cornish Duchy here. In 1864, a hoard of gold coins was found in the parish church. The treasury of the English crown demanded it. However, the Duchy of Cornwall demanded it too, to which the English monarchy demanded legal paperwork to prove they had sovereignty here. The duchy, which itself is now nothing more than an extension of the English royal family, found a document that says that the Duke's power, quote, expressly prohibits any such minister of the crown acting within Cornwall. Because of this, the English crown backed down from their claim to the Cornish gold and sort of acknowledged the fact that the Duke of Cornwall has sole governing authority within this part, separate from the English crown. This church was presided over by Cornish patriot Reverend Rs Hawker. He's an interesting character who wrote the anthem of Cornwall, Trelawney, in its modern form in 1824. It was a folk song that was sung in secret long before he actually put pen to paper, celebrating a relative of his own who was imprisoned in the Tower of London for his support of the Royalists. The song has remained popular in Cornwall because it isn't openly advocating for independence, but for a unique sense of identity and culture. Bishop Hawker himself had many stories, and his life as a royal priest near the border of Cornwall and England was more exciting than it let on. His church has an Anglo-Saxon font discovered in the ruins of a Celtic church that was found when the Norman invaders expanded and rebuilt. This shows that the Saxons were able to push into the territory of Dunoia quite a ways to establish living centers, and the original kingdom of Dunoia also included Devon. Hawker was a compassionate man, climbing down the dangerous cliffs to retrieve the bodies of shipwrecked mariners and give them a proper Christian burial. In other parts of Cornwall, they were often just left at sea or buried on the beach. In this churchyard he buried 5 from the crew of the Caledonia, mounting the wooden hull of the boat as a memorial, and some years later he buried over 30 in a mass grave, remembering them with a monument that reads, "Unknown, but well known." When he wasn't preaching, he lived oftentimes in a secluded hut on the ocean cliffs, made of driftwood and broken bits of wood from boats. He smoked opium, wrote poems, and watched the sea. The story of Tristan and Isolde predate the romances of Guinevere and King Arthur, and these would go on to be some of the most influential romances of the early modern period in Europe. They predate basically and set the groundwork for all romances that would follow, and it's a beautiful meld of both Celtic and Roman culture. Basically, the story goes that a powerful knight challenged Tristan of Lyonesse, and the two sailed their boats off the coast to a small island. Tristan sunk his own boat so that only one man would be able to return to the shore. He vanquishes this rival knight, but as the knight's dying, he reveals that his own sword had poison on it, and that Tristan would die a slow and painful death unless he sought help from his sister, a girl named Isolde in Ireland. And so Tristan begins his quest to find this woman and be healed himself. So he goes to Ireland with the body of the vanquished knight. He claims to be a poet and woos the queen Isolde by playing the harp so beautifully that she demands he help her learn. After 40 days of teaching her, she notices that he's sick and dying, and so she heals him of his wounds, not knowing that he's the knight that killed her brother. Tristan returns to Cornwall feeling a little bit guilty, but stories of Isolde's beauty soon spread. and King Mark demands his nephew Tristan go and win her hand in marriage for him. Tristan goes back to Ireland to pick up Isolde for his uncle Mark. He slays the dragon that's been plaguing the island, and here the story gets a little more complicated, ending in Isolde discovering his true identity by seeing the nick in his sword that corresponds to her piece, but forgiving him after almost killing him. It's revealed that Ireland and Cornwall were united, and that the older Irish queen made a love potion, basically thinking that she would not want to love King Mark, who was a much older man. On the way back, however, Tristan and Isolde drink this potion together so that King Mark becomes known as the Cuckold King. The two younger couple fall madly in love for each other and have to keep this a secret from Tristan's uncle. King Mark slowly goes more and more mad, denying that there's a love triangle going on. What makes it more complicated is that Tristan truly does love Mark because he sees him as a father figure, and Isolde truly does appreciate him for his wisdom and kindness, but the two younger lovers are madly head over heels for each other. King Mark chases them off, but after discovering them sleeping away from each other with a sword between them, feels guilty and thinks that they might be innocent. Tristan is banished, and Isolde goes back to King Mark, and for a while, Tristan just goes on a wandering journey around the different kingdoms of the world, going on different adventures, but eventually he ends up poisoned, and again, Isolde is the only one who can cure him. By now, King Mark has several different wives, one of them a little bit older and less on the eyes, as Isolde. And so, through spite, the older wife of Mark wrongly tells the close-to-death Tristan that the ship approaching was using black sails to indicate that they could not win back Isolde and bring her to help cure Tristan. So Tristan dies of a broken heart, and Isolde rushes to him and dies by his side. Mark returned the two to Cornwall and gave them a dignified burial, realizing that the two must have been lovers. He buries them side by side, and two trees grew up overnight, with their branches and trunks intertwined. Nearby is Mark's castle and the ancient cross for Tristan. As an aside, it's said that Tristan was from Lyonesse, a lost Celtic kingdom just off the coast of Cornwall which sunk under the waves just like Sodom and Gomorrah. Today, there are fascinating Celtic ruins in the Isles of Scilly, showing that the water was once much lower, possibly even suggesting that there was once an ancient kingdom on these small rocks.